Welcome back to Refactoring Paleo Rows. My name is Tom. This episode, we're going to fix how we create new data layers in the application. Now, as you may remember, we've been in this situation where I made the mistake of rewriting how I read and write to the data files, and that's led to all sorts of consequences. And so now I'm trying to fix them. And one of the things we need to be able to do is be able to open, close data files, and then be able to create data layers. What's the problem? Well, after a little bit of testing, much of this is already now working. If you remember from the last episode, we got the drawing working in, we got a lot of stuff working again. But what I've noticed is that the little plus button down here that's in the circle doesn't work the way I expect it to. The job of that button is to create a new layer that we can see a data set. So we may want to have a different variation of the data that we're showing, or we want to draw it from a different data set altogether. But right now, it doesn't work. What do we need to do? Well, we want to get it functional. That's our priority. Because if this is not functional, we can't use the app at all. And that's kind of our major goal, is get the app functional enough that you can download it and use it. Our second goal is to get rid of SQL calls from the view controllers. This is kind of a weird pattern that I had back at the time, and it made a bit of sense. If you don't have a lot of experience in building applications, you may put a lot of code somewhere that it really shouldn't be. A view controller really shouldn't handle any kind of complex data handling. It's not its job. It's just its job is to control the view. It should ask for the data and then send the data to the view. And when the view updates, any changes can go back to the view controller, and the view controller can notify out that there's been a change. But in our case, the view controller is actually touching the database itself. And we have that all over the place, but we need to get rid of it because ultimately we need somewhere else to control that so we can change how the SQL is done, or just get rid of SQL altogether. We can use something else. So this is a very, very bad pattern that we need to get rid of. Next, one of our next goals is to get rid of zips. Zips are a great tool, but they're getting outdated. One of the best things about zips is you can visually put together a view, so you can actually see it. But since the advent of SwiftUI and the movement to SwiftUI, we now have previews, and previews can quite happily show UIKit or AppKit stuff as well as SwiftUI. And in my book, that just totally gets rid of the need for zips. So we want to get rid of the zips that will be used when we hit that plus button. Our final goal in updating this code is to simplify it where we can. This is one of the hardest things for me to do. I have a brain that loves to overcomplicate. Backing off and simplify is always hard for me to do, but we're going to have to do it in this particular case. Let's jump in. Here we are in our test file, and we have Xcode in the background there. Let's just see it not working. So let's click on the plus button. We want to add a layer. We get this. This view is trying to set it up so that we can pull data from a particular table, choose a data column, and give it a name to the layer. There is a button here for show advanced options, which isn't working very well. Click on that button again, it does a weird resizing thing. And then it didn't do it that time, so it's kind of irregular. And then we have these cancel and create buttons that are way too close together for comfort. It's too close to the edge, too close to each other. There's way too much space in between. If we can't choose a table, we can't choose anything. Let's take a look at what's going on. So let's see if we can find the zip. So it's not the main menu zip, because the main menu zip is for the toolbars and stuff. We want the document zip. So let's see, here it is. This is the zip for the document. If we click on this, and we open up our sidebar, we can get, so what I'm looking for is the action. So it's the add layer action that points to the owner. The owner in this case is a window controller, not the document itself, but a window controller. So we're looking for add layer action in the window controller. Let's see, here it is. Let's see if we can find it. Here's add layer action. Here it is. And it's just a pass-through, which is pretty much what I would expect, to the document. Now we got to go to the document for the add data layer. And then we have this function or this method, load data set, and this is where much of the action takes place. As you can see, there's a couple of things here. If we have a URL to the file, and if we don't, there should be a slight difference, but I don't see it, what the difference actually is in this case. So we have same view controller being created with pulling the table list from this file or from the document, and then picking the SQLite pointer. This right here is one of our goals. This doesn't make any sense to send a pointer for SQLite to our view controller. This should be just in our in-memory store that we just pass the information to, and it should do all the work. So we can see that we're managing a controller in the document. So we set it. Get the main window controller, do begin sheet, and completion handler. One thing to be aware of, especially if you're a newer Mac developer, sheets are quite a bit different today than they used to be. Around 10.13, I think, there was a change. It used to be that the sheets would animate down from the top of the window, and now they just pop up like an alert. So I think the API is the same, more or less, but there's a difference in how they appear. We have this completion handler that we pass in, where if the response is okay, we do one thing, and if the response is not okay, we don't do anything at all. As a matter of fact, we do the same thing regardless. Whether or not it was okay, we just clear it out from the memory tracker. And this is stemming from the fact that specifically at the time, I'm not sure about right now, we can look into that, where you can have memory leaks because you're not maintaining, adding, and releasing these kinds of controllers. Once we get the response back and we want to create a data set, we create a new data set. We see if there's a predicate that the user this is one of the things we're going to draw. This is actually a pretty complicated process, and it's going to be even worse if I make a decision to change away from SQLite. Given my user base is probably pretty small, we're just going to drop this. So right now, the user will have to do the stuff outside the app and just bring it in. So what this predicate does is a way for you, the user, to set the predicate of this SQL call so you can pick and choose what data you want out of your data set. Just basically adding to your SQL query to bring the data in. But we're going to drop that for simplicity, and I'll show you why real quick. For that view, we have our pop-ups, and we have this crazy thing. If you're looking at that and wondering what it does, to be honest, when I first looked at this again, I'm like, I don't know what it does either. What it's for is a window, so you can set up an end of the SQLite SQL call. And the little validate button will then allow you to validate whether or not your SQL is correct. I'm going to get rid of that for now. We can reintroduce it later, but the main thing is we want to get the thing working. So we have a choice of whether or not we want to build a set based on the user selection, whether or not there was a predicate or not. We can get rid of the predicate, so we don't need that anymore, at least not for now, and just go with one way to create the data set. We give it a name, and if the set is valid, we basically add all that to the data store. But this all has a change. It's not working primarily because it's not getting enough information out of here to display it on screen. Notice that there is no document model being referenced anywhere except for the SQLite in-memory store pointer. So this whole mechanism isn't particularly great. Let's take a look at the main dataset controller and take a look in here. So we initialize it with a table array, which includes the list of the table names and the in-memory store. Here we actually set the DB to the in-memory store. We have a list of tables. We have an empty array of columns and selected columns. Those are selectable right now, but let's go through. So when we awake from nib, remember this is only going to happen if you're using a XIB. Awake from nib, we populate, clear out the table names, add it with the tables that we came in with, and then we do this column called select columns. We'll look at that in a minute. That will populate the columns list. We're doing some interesting frame tracking. I don't know if we'll need that anymore. And then we have this ability to show the advanced view or not, whether or not the SQL is valid, and whether or not we have an error text view. Okay. And then we have the ability to cancel and create. Basically, this is an end sheet command. This is actually out of date. We need to update this code to something a bit more modern. Same with this. In case you're wondering, this is passing a failure, cancel, or an OK. And now we get into the select columns. The select columns action. So this thing needs to get a list of the columns based on the table that you selected. So if you pick a table, what columns are available to be your data set? So this is SQL being called directly by the view controller. We don't want this at all. We need to send this back through the chain to tell somebody who actually knows how to do it to do the work and then pass up the results back up to this view controller. All of this should be done somewhere else. And we have some information that we can get out of the view controller, like select a table, select a column, selected name. And this is what happens when you do the show advanced select. So if you hit the advanced button, it's going to restructure it. And this is also what's failing here. So somewhere in here, when we deselect, it's picking the wrong frame to move around. This is for the predicate. This is also for the predicate. Stuff we're going to get rid of to simplify. This is also for the predicate, also for the predicate, and that's the actual predicate. So much of this is going to go away. Very happily go away. We're trying to simplify this. All right. This is a lot to cover. I'm going to take a short break, come back, and we're going to start making these changes. Here we are with two new files. We have dataset creation sheet and the dataset creation sheet view. So I had these two files created by Claude Code, but I had to go in and make some edits in them to make them a little bit more my style. This sheet is actually the view controller, and this file is the actual view. So these two files replace these three. Now, as I mentioned, I wanted to simplify this a bit, so I've dropped this section of this interface. It is overly complicated, and I have to rethink about how I want to do this. Because again, as I mentioned, I may choose not to use SQLite in the future. I may keep it, I might change it, but I need something a little bit more flexible. So let's take a look at the view real quick. So I'm letting the preview set up. So now this is what the view looks like. It's a little bit better, cleaner design. I've rearranged this so the layer name's at the top, which makes a bit more sense. But the rest of it's pretty much the same. When we look at the file for the view, it is pretty much a standard AppKit view. So we have all the components, we have the layout, and everything else. Now, one thing that I felt like I had to change with the way this worked is I don't like having other objects come in to a view and manipulate view components directly. That always feels a little dirty to me. Sometimes I'll let it happen, but in this case, I decided I wanted to do something a little bit different. So one is I have a defined public API and all the view components are private. So you can't get in to manipulate these directly. So I have this API, which includes setting the placeholder name. So like the whisper text or the grayed out text that goes in here is based on the table name. So if you don't change the layer name, it will just be the name of the table that you're choosing. Next, we can set all the available tables. We do all the detail work that we need to do to set up these tables. We need to remove all the items, add the items that we're sending in, and then select the first one. So when we make that change, we always select the first one, and we have to do all these steps. There's no reason why we need to do all these steps somewhere else. Why not just do it here? Same is true for the available columns and a way to get the actual values out of them. So the selected layer name, select table name, and the column name. So we have a way to get all three of these out. I could do this all in one call as well. I haven't decided. I might change that in the future. We also have a few delegate actions. So we have this delegate protocol where we change the table, and then we also have hitting the cancel button or create button. So those two buttons. The view itself doesn't handle that. So we have to have a way to call out. So we have to have a delegate. And so there is our delegate connection, which is a weak connection because we always want that weak. So if we go down somewhere down in here somewhere, we can see where those delegate methods are called. So if then we go to the view controller, this is actually handling all the view controller work. And notice we also have a preview on the view controller. So we have a preview on the view and we have a preview on the view. So this is pretty much as you'd expect. It hasn't been fully cleaned up. There's a lot of private stuff and there's a protocol for something that we need. So when we initialize this view controller, if I can find it, there we go. We need to have this dataset column provider. Because when we change the table name, we need to call into this provider to get a list of all the columns. And remember, this was a key function that the old version was doing. If we go into the old version, that's what all this is. This is all these SQLite calls to find out what are all the table columns that are available. But we don't want to call into SQLite directly. We want to have that pass through to somebody who actually controls SQL. Now that we've done this, we've now decoupled SQLite from this view controller. This view controller now has no idea how these data are stored. It's just that it needs these items. And that's good because if we decide to choose to change something in the future, it'll be easy to do. But it's also providing documentation on how it works without having long lists of comments trying to explain it. It is there. We have this protocol. We need to have this thing to provide it these column names. It's pretty simple. Now, some people for small projects would argue that this isn't necessary, and maybe for you it is. I just like having these clean interfaces, decoupling, to make it easier to work on this app in the future. And this app is 20 years old, and because I did not do these things, they came back to bite me, and I have to redo everything in a hard way. It's just pretty much the basic things on how to update this view and also some view controller lifestyle. We can look at this in the future, or we'll look at this in a few minutes, to make sure it's all working correctly. And we have, of course, the preview at the bottom. Now, the question is, does it work? Let's build and run. So here we go. All right. So we have this new interface, but it's wrong. There's no table names. There's no column names. No default layer name. So what's going on here? Why isn't that working? Well, again, we don't have some of this stuff that this view controller requires ready to go. So let's go down to the document. This is where we're actually calling into this view. So this is that same call, load dataset, where we create our new view controller. Right now it's saying the column provider is itself. And we're also using self tables. If you remember correctly, when we originally did this, self tables was not updated properly. So this is the incorrect information. And it's very likely that as a column provider, this is probably not a good choice either, at least the way it's currently set up. Now, as we go through this, we can see it's largely the same as it was. We have set that view controller to the current sheet view controller so we don't lose control of it. We have the sheet being created, and then if we get a return code of OK, we do this work. We are not populating our view. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is the same problem that we had before, is that we weren't actually passing it the correct data. So here we have where the controller is built, but here is where we provide its information. Now, this array, which is the list of tables, isn't how we're really tracking this anymore. So let's update that. So that's going to come from the document model. And this column provider is right now the self. At some point, we may want to move it. So just to remind ourselves what the column provider is, it has to have this array, or this function that says we pass in the table, and it gives us the list of columns that we can use. So we should have that somewhere in here. And there it is. We have get the non-text columns from the table with the table name. And then if that tends to be empty, we just give it an empty array and return that. Follow that through a little bit. Let's go to that. Here it is. Go to the document model and get the possible column names from the table. We get an error back because I believe that is the throwing function. And then we can handle that error or return. Okay, so we should be able to correctly get those data. So let's run it and see if we're not working. Okay, now we're populated. We have a default name, we have the single table, and we have the choice of columns. So let's just call it our test 3. And here we have the data. And that may look a little strange because that's the same data as up in here. The main thing is that we're not treating it as bidirectional. So if we turn that on, it'll look almost exactly the same as the other data. So yes, it's working. At this appearance, it looks like it's working fine, but it's not. If we try to save this, it will probably not store this data correctly. That's okay for now. What we'll do is we'll add a card to my list of cards that I have in a Kanban board saying that we haven't fixed this yet. But the issue is that we're not properly updating everything in the document model when it comes to the data set. And because we're not doing that, we're going to have problems in the future. Now, why am I not going to do that right now? Well, I did explore that a bit, and it's a big kettle of fish that we need to do. So I'm going to do that as a separate episode. But if we come back to our document, we can see that this process, we have an issue here that we still have the memory store in use here. As I mentioned, that this is a whole kettle of fish because to create the data set, we need to actually extract the data out of the table. And that's why this is here. But this really should not be here at all anymore because I don't want to have direct access to this memory store anymore. And that was one of our goals to get rid of. We did get rid of it out of the view controller and the view, so those aren't touching the database anymore, but we still have it here. And because it's here, it's not the design I want. But that implies I'm going to have to reconstruct how we create data sets on the fly. And I need to do that because at some point, like I said many times already, that we may not be using this database anymore. And indeed, we have this second call to set the name of the data set, and it's not actually available up in here. So that's another weird thing. But it is creating this data set, and it is displaying the data. So right now, at least in terms of this, it works. But this process does not get it into the document model where we need it, which is into this array of data sets. I'm going to hold off on that for now. I might do it next time or a few episodes in the future because eventually I'm going to have to get to it. Well, until next time, my name's Tom, and this has been Refactoring Bailey Road.